I just saw this video of Gary Brecka talking about why people can't lose weight.
I want to know why people can't lose weight. What's the nutrient they're missing?
There's three reasons why the majority of people can't lose weight. The primary reason is because of insulin resistance.
Right.
Thankfully, that's completely incorrect. Insulin resistance is not the reason why people can't lose weight. In fact, research shows that insulin resistance does not prevent weight loss whatsoever. In this video, we're going to cover what insulin is, what causes insulin resistance, how does that impact weight loss, and what the research actually shows. Let's get into it. So, what is insulin and what does it do? As you guys probably know, insulin is a hormone that we secrete specifically from these cells called beta cells in our pancreas, okay? And these beta cells in our pancreas secrete insulin in response to us consuming carbohydrates, more specifically glucose, okay? Which glucose is just one type of carbohydrate essentially. But when we consume carbohydrates, our bodies release insulin, and the reason it does that is to help shuttle glucose from our blood into different tissues, like our muscle, our liver, our fat. Okay, so when we eat carbs, we digest them, our blood glucose goes up, and then we need to do something with that blood glucose. We need to move it from the blood into the muscle, into the liver, into the fat, and insulin helps facilitate that process. Okay, what I want to explain is how that actually works. So in order for glucose to go into a cell, into a tissue, let's talk about muscle specifically. So in order for glucose to go from the blood into a muscle cell, we need the presence of what's called a glucose transporter. Okay, so in the muscle, the specific glucose transporter, this isn't super important, but it's called GLUT4, G-L-U-T-4. Okay, it's not about glutes, like having juicy glutes, even though we all want juicy glutes. It's the name of the transporter, okay? And it's an acronym. I forget the particular acronym right now, but the GLUT4 is the protein that is essentially the transporter protein that's necessary for glucose to be able to go into the cell, right? So essentially GLUT4 comes to the cell membrane, which is the outer part of the muscle cell. It opens up and glucose can go in. But in order for it to be able to do that, it needs to move from inside of the cell to the membrane or the outside of the cell, right? Generally, the GLUT4 transporter just kind of chills inside of the cell unless there's a particular signal that tells it to move to the membrane. One of those signals is insulin, right? So insulin, whenever we eat carbs, we release the insulin, and then insulin binds to the insulin receptor on a muscle cell, right? And binding of insulin to the insulin receptor essentially tells the GLUT4 transporter that's chilling inside the cell to move to the cell membrane, right? So without the action of insulin, this GLUT4 transporter can't move to the cell membrane. And that's why insulin is important to uptake glucose, right? Because it helps translocate this GLUT4 transporter in muscle cells from inside the cell to the cell membrane, so then glucose can kind of go inside the cell. And insulin is one of the signals that helps do that. Like muscle contraction is something else. Like when you contract muscles, GLUT4 translocates to the cell membrane. That's why like resistance training is so beneficial for glucose regulation. But nonetheless, talking about insulin here specifically, that's how insulin helps glucose be shuttled into different cells, right? It helps with the mobilization of glucose transporters to the cell membrane so that glucose can then go inside. Now, on the flip side of that, insulin also slows down a process called beta oxidation, which is essentially the name for the process of how our body breaks down fat to use for energy. Okay, so insulin, one, helps uptake glucose from the blood into different tissues while simultaneously slowing down fat breakdown. This is why people say, like, if you eat carbs, you can't lose weight because insulin, and it slows down fat breakdown. But that's just not the entire picture, okay? And it makes common sense that something like insulin would slow down fat breakdown, right? Because insulin is what we call an anabolic hormone. It helps with growth. We release insulin after we are fed, and it just doesn't make sense for your body to break down fat if it's fed, right? If you just eat, your body's going to be using the energy from the food, metabolizing the food specifically. It's going to prefer that over using stored body fat, right? Because we only need stored body fat if we are not in a fed state, if we are in what's called a catabolic state, which is just the opposite of an anabolic state, okay? In general, whenever we are in a fed state, we are going to slow down processes that are catabolic, right? So anytime we eat, we're going to slow down fat breakdown. Anytime we're not eating and we fasted, we are going to increase fat breakdown, right? So given the fact that insulin is released when we consume carbohydrates and we're in a fed state, it's not necessarily, it is that insulin directly slows down fat breakdown, but it makes sense, right? Because your body, you don't lose weight or gain weight, or I should say lose fat or gain fat based off what's going on in the moment when you eat. It's really throughout the 24 hours, right? Of how much fat you're storing versus how much fat you're breaking down. And that process is completely void of insulin levels. And then on top of that, it's not like you eat carbs, you release insulin, you don't eat carbs, you don't release insulin. You always have some level of insulin in your blood. So it really depends on the dose as well. But we'll cover some research. Even on really, really high carbohydrate diets, insulin itself doesn't just prevent fat loss by any means, right? So I guess the next thing we really want to talk about, now that we understand what insulin is and what insulin does, is what is insulin resistance specifically? And insulin resistance is essentially when your cells become less responsive to insulin. Okay, so you require more insulin to have the same action, okay? So essentially, remember how I mentioned earlier that the insulin needs to bind to the insulin receptor, and then that causes some sort of downstream signal that tells, for example, the GLUT4 protein to translocate to the cell membrane? Well, essentially, when you are insulin resistant, your body's not as sensitive to insulin, so you require more of it for the same thing to happen, right? And it could be due to a number of reasons. It could be that the insulin isn't binding to the insulin receptor with the same affinity, so you require more insulin to bind the same number of receptors. Or it could be that insulin is binding to the receptor, but the signal that's supposed to happen after that tells the GLUT4 molecule to translate to the cell membrane just isn't happening as effectively, right? So as a response, as a byproduct, your body actually produces more insulin. And so you have more insulin in your blood. You have elevated insulin levels when you have insulin resistance. And since insulin, I mentioned earlier, slows down beta oxidation, aka fat breakdown, the whole narrative here is that when you're insulin resistant, you have higher insulin levels. So that slows down fat breakdown. So if you want to lose fat, you need to improve your insulin levels because insulin is what's preventing you from losing fat. And that's just not true. We're going to cover the science in a second, but one thing I want to share is kind of just some common sense here that people don't even think about. First and foremost, when we say that insulin resistance means that your cells are less sensitive to the effects of insulin, that isn't just for the anabolic properties, right? That isn't just for bringing in glucose. It's also the slowing of beta oxidation or the slowing of the fat breakdown, right? Insulin isn't sending the signal correctly. So even though, yes, we have more insulin, it's not slowing down fat breakdown more because, again, in order to slow down fat breakdown, insulin needs to bind to the insulin receptor on fat cells specifically, and one of the downstream mechanisms slows down beta oxidation. But when we're insulin resistant, our body is also more resistant to that process specifically, right? So it's insulin resistance is global and affects fat breakdown as well as glucose storage. It's not it affects glucose storage, you're less sensitive there, but now all this insulin is just preventing you from losing a ton of fat. It's just not the case. And what I want to do here is go into some research to see what the research actually shows when it comes to insulin resistance and weight loss, right? If insulin resistance actually prevented weight loss, one, we would assume that diabetics would have a really hard time losing weight, especially if they are on a high carbohydrate diet, right? And we would also anticipate seeing that people with insulin resistance would have a harder time losing weight than people who are more sensitive to insulin, independent of what the diet is. And spoiler alert, the research doesn't support that. So the first study I want to review is a study that was published in Frontiers of Nutrition. That's the name of the journal, in 2022. In this study, there were 72 adults with type 2 diabetes, and they were also obese, and they were randomized to one of two diets. Now, both of the diets were controlled for calories, so they had the same number of calories. One was just a higher carb, lower protein diet, and the other was a lower carb, higher protein diet. Okay, so the lower carb diet was 30% carbs, 30% protein, 40% fat. Now, a limitation here is that like 30% carb is still not really low carb by any means. And some people might be like, that's not a low carb diet, but it's still lower than the alternative. The alternative was 50% carbohydrate and only 17% protein, right? So big difference there in terms of the quantity of carbohydrate, almost twice the amount of carbohydrates. However, again, calories were controlled. The participants were fed all their food, so they knew how much they were eating. And they were in the study for 6 weeks. And they lost 6% of their total body weight over the 6 weeks. So they were losing about 1% of their body weight per week. And what they found was that, first off, both groups lost the exact same amount of weight. So whether they were high carb or lower carb, it did not impact weight loss whatsoever. And then subsequently, there were no differences when it came to improvements in insulin sensitivity or the function of the beta cells, right? Like sometimes there's issues with beta cell function, but we're talking about insulin sensitivity here specifically. There were no differences, meaning that carbohydrate restriction did not improve weight loss and it did not improve metabolic health. In particular, we're talking about insulin here, but it did not improve insulin sensitivity beyond weight loss. And what the authors concluded is that the improvements in metabolic health and insulin are primarily driven through weight loss specifically, not through the macronutrient composition of the diet. So you don't have to be on a low carb diet to improve your insulin levels. You don't have to be on a low carb diet to lose weight. Being in a calorie deficit is sufficient for weight loss. Actually, it's the only thing that's required for weight loss. And weight loss itself is what it improves insulin sensitivity, not the other way around, at least according to this study. Now, as I mentioned, what they mainly looked at here were diabetics and then like the composition of the diet. Is the composition of the diet different, right? But another angle to look at this is like, what if the diet is the same and we just look at how insulin resistant people are and see if people who are more insulin resistant lose less weight than people who are more sensitive to insulin, so less insulin resistant, right? So this other diet is a little bit of an older diet, this other study is a little bit of an older study published in 1999, but it's really well designed. And essentially all of the participants were on the same diet, on the same calorie deficit. What they wanted to see was whether or not there's a correlation between how much weight people lose and their degree of insulin resistance. So 31 obese adults were placed on a calorie-restricted diet. They were also losing about 1% of their total body weight per week, and they were on the diet for about 60 days. And again, what they wanted to see was whether or not insulin resistance affects the ability to lose weight on a calorie-restricted diet. On average, over the 60 days, participants lost about 18 pounds. And very similarly, what they found was that there was no correlation between their initial levels of insulin resistance and weight loss. Okay, meaning people who had more insulin resistance didn't lose less weight. They lost the same amount of weight as people who were more insulin sensitive. Same with insulin levels. Higher levels of insulin did not prevent weight loss at all, right? And there were about 10 participants that didn't finish the study. 31 participants were included in the study. 10 did not lose weight, and it's because they weren't adherent with the diet, essentially, so they were excluded. And when we look at the people that didn't lose any weight, it was literally half of them were insulin sensitive, half of them were insulin resistant. So again, no evidence to support the fact that insulin resistance or insulin levels prevents weight loss by any means. And in fact, the research actually shows that the opposite is what's true, right? We don't need to improve insulin to lose weight. The data clearly show that weight loss is necessary in order to improve insulin sensitivity, right? So you actually need to lose weight first in order to improve insulin sensitivity, not the other way around. And it's mainly because what causes insulin resistance is not sugar, it's not carbs, it's primarily chronic inflammation. And many things drive chronic inflammation, but one of them is having excess body fat, right? So here's the thing. I want to explain a little bit more about how insulin resistance is actually caused and what are the contributing factors, so you really understand why it's weight loss specifically that helps you improve your insulin levels, and insulin doesn't prevent weight loss by any means. As I just mentioned, chronic inflammation is one of the contributing factors to insulin resistance. And yes, there are some lifestyle factors like sleep, being physically inactive, and being overly stressed, I shouldn't just say sleep in general, poor sleep, right? That contribute to increases in chronic inflammation. There's also a genetic component, right? Genetics influence pretty much everything. We can't deny that. But there's a huge body composition component as well. So having excess fat itself, the fat tissue itself, causes inflammation. And this is what I want to explain. First and foremost, fat, aka adipose tissue, is what we consider, or what we call, an endocrine organ, meaning it releases hormones and it releases hormone-like molecules that travel through our blood and have an impact on other tissues, right? So our fat will release stuff that impacts our muscle, our heart, our liver, etc. And the stuff it releases can change depending on the environment, okay? So when we gain body fat and we gain excess weight, the size of our fat cells increase as well as the number of fat cells increase, and that changes the environment, right? First, it's a more crammed environment because the fat cells are more compressed within a certain volume essentially, right? And there's going to be less oxygen supply as well. Let me explain why that is. We have capillaries, which are tiny little blood vessels that provide blood and oxygen specifically to pretty much all the cells of our body. However, when fat cells grow and we have excess adiposity, I'm not talking about just like gaining a little bit of weight, but like being really overweight or obese. One, the fat tissue is so crammed, and two, it grows at such a rate that the capillaries don't really infiltrate the tissue as well as they should. So there's less oxygen supply to all of the fat cells, right? And if they're getting less oxygen, that's what we call being in a hypoxic environment. Hypoxic meaning low oxygen availability. And when there's low oxygen availability, that essentially triggers the fat cells to change the quantity of the stuff that they're secreting. And essentially in this hypoxic environment, aka when you gain weight and there's less blood flow to the tissue, they release more pro-inflammatory molecules, things that are causing chronic inflammation. Things like TNF-alpha, interleukin-6, right? These are just molecules that are inflammatory molecules. And it is these inflammatory molecules specifically that inhibit the actions of insulin, right? So some of them prevent insulin from binding to the insulin receptor. So now you need to produce more insulin to have the same action. Some of them prevent some of the downstream mechanisms. Remember I mentioned that insulin binds to the insulin receptor and that causes certain things to happen inside the cell that then, for example, tell the GLUT4 molecule to locate to the cell membrane. Well, some of these inflammatory molecules prevent that from happening effectively, right? So now you have an increase in these pro-inflammatory molecules that are directly impacting the ability of insulin to function the way that it should. So now you have insulin resistance and now you have higher insulin levels. But that's not caused because you were eating sugar or carbs. It's simply caused because you've been overeating, right? Relative to the amount of energy that you're burning. So you're slowly gaining weight, whether you're doing that with carbs, with sugar, with fat, it doesn't matter. It's weight gain itself, right? And the funny thing is that mechanistically, people are like, eat low carb, eat more fat. Saturated fat itself, saturated fat impacts the actions of insulin. It causes insulin resistance. But that's a completely different topic for another day. So hopefully that helps you really understand and see why it is excess adiposity itself, excess body weight, that's contributing to chronic inflammation and insulin resistance, not the other way around. And if you do have insulin resistance and you are struggling with weight, please don't fall for any of these hacks or things that you see online of like going low carb or taking apple cider vinegar before your meals so that you don't spike your glucose. It's all nonsense, guys. Our glucose is supposed to go up and down. It's supposed to go up after a meal. It's normal for us to release insulin. Our glucose is then supposed to go down back to normal. All of that is normal. And it's not the fact that you spike your glucose throughout the day that's causing you to be insulin resistant. Like, not at all. If you're maintaining a healthy body weight, healthy body composition, that stuff doesn't do anything, right? If you want to improve your health and you need to lose weight, it's really about creating a sustainable caloric deficit and focusing on all the stuff that I talk about here on this podcast all the time. I mean, it's the stuff that isn't sexy but works, and it's the stuff that we implement with all of our clients at Fit for Life Academy. I can tell you how many clients we've worked with that one of their goals when they started working with us, they're like, I want to improve insulin levels. I'm insulin resistant. I also have high cholesterol. And I'm like, listen, if we lose weight, if we build muscle, if we improve our habits, these things will improve. And it's the stuff I always talk about. Lift weights, focus on building muscle, have a healthy and sustainable diet, eat in a mild calorie deficit, prioritize protein and fiber, right? It's consistency and application that people struggle with. And that's where coaching comes in, where we like help people navigate this stuff. And it's like, hey, what does your diet look like? What do family dinners look like? What does work look like? And we help them like implement this stuff in a way that feels sustainable given their lifestyle, and teach them how to do it correctly. But the information itself, guys, don't look for hacks and tricks and novel methods to lose weight and improve insulin on social media, because it's just all a lie. So anyways, guys, I hope this episode helps. And if you do have a friend or a family member that's struggling with being insulin resistant, or if they're struggling with being overweight or obese, and they're following for a lot of these claims and going on all these crazy diets, do them a favor and send them this episode. I think it would really, really help. Anyways, with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll catch you next week.